All right, everyone. Hi, good afternoon. My name is Kelly Sharp. I'm the director of the Center for Medical Humanities, and I'm so excited today to welcome Chelsea Lee, who is a sixth year PhD candidate in at UCI English Department. Her research bridges medieval and early modern literatures, especially how theories of death, medicine, and the human body intersect and how that seeps into dramatic, poetic, religious, and secular text of their time. Her dissertation, Death Without Dying, Playing Dead on Shakespearean Stage, focused on the trope of false death in Shakespeare's plays and how they can read as an extensions of medieval and early modern death art. So, Chelsea, welcome so much. I'm excited. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here today. And I'm going to turn the floor over to you. So, if you want to share your screen, and thanks for your time. Thanks for everyone joining.
Thank you. Let me just share this. Okay. Is that coming through?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, perfect. Um, so yeah, thank you all for being here. I would just like to thank the Center for Medical Humanities for its support of my research over the summer, and for this opportunity to discuss my research in this sort of work in progress talk. The work I'm going to be sharing today is coming from a chapter from my dissertation, and it is very much still in progress. So you'll notice that much of my talk today is going to involve placing historical medical contexts into conversation with this literary text that deals with depictions of healing and medical practice. The overall project of the dissertation is a concern with a particular literary trope, that of a falsified fake or mistake death. This trope of false or counterfeit death is pervasive throughout Shakespeare's works, and Shakespeare is the author that I primarily focus on in my dissertation. And to clarify kind of the definition of the trope so that we're on the same page, is that I define the false death trope as any moment in a play where either the characters within the play or the audience are led to believe that a certain character has died, but later that death is revealed to have been falsified, misattributed, premature, or mistaken. And perhaps the most famous and obvious example of this within Shakespeare's works that we can think of would be Romeo and Juliet, wherein Juliet, in order to avoid an arranged marriage, takes an elixir that will send her body into a death imitating coma. Um, and while Romeo and Juliet might be the most prominent example, it is by far not the only example, nor is it kind of emblematic of a standard. So, in order to kind of truly understand the way that this trope works, I'm interested in kind of understanding the various ways that playing dead in these texts has different affordances based on the different plays. Um, and notably, kind of as I'm broadly defining the trope, uh, we can kind of find it in around 24 of Shakespeare's works. So kind of we're edging into a vast majority of the things that he does. So I'm kind of interested to think about why um, this particular concept kind of comes up over and over again. Uh, Previous kind of scholarship on this trope or kind of looking at this concept have been more concerned with the idea that, in order to fake a death, you can kind of then generate a resurrection on stage. And the idea that something can be gained from kind of living in that space of death or kind of mimicking death in that way receives a lot less attention. So, uh, these false deaths are often kind of evaluated through their success and often through like the aftermath. So I am interested in pushing back on these types of readings and asking kind of questions about if people can gain knowledge and insight, maybe participate in philosophical or different practices, through these moments where they're kind of put into a false death state. And so what I wish to argue overall in the dissertation is that the trope of false death or counterfeit death evolves at the nexus of various medieval and early modern death arts. It combines the methodology and meditative impulses of the Ars Moriendi with the more embodied and imitative forms of the memento mori. And death arts, broadly defined, kind of evolve as ways to foster um, familiarity with death, explore epistemological, practical, ethical, emotional, and spiritual affordances of our encounters with death, and ameliorate the possibility for a sudden death, which would have been of particular concern during the early modern and medieval periods. And they're meant to be creating these kind of frameworks for preparation and mindfulness. The term Ars Moriendi is specifically referring to 15th century texts, and they're concerned with the art of dying. And in other words, they're kind of the proper way to prepare for death and administer aid to the dying. And these manuals attempt to systematize and define what we can see as a good death. So my work kind of comes in to situate how the trope of false death works more complexly to satisfy the demands of these sort of philosophical and artistic traditions. However, just like any other death art, the motivations, affordances, and ultimate products of a feigned death are mutable and diverse. By turning to Shakespeare's plays where the trope appears and appears over and over again, this project seeks to explore some of those distinct instances of false death, focusing most intently on how the experience of the death impacts the characters and how the theatrical convention functions as an intellectual and spiritual tool, similar to any other death art. And kind of examining the different ways that this trope appears in the different plays, my work brought me to this play, All's Well That Ends Well. And a brief summary of the play, for those not familiar with it, as it's both lesser known and notoriously problematic from Shakespeare's roster. All's Well That Ends Well is a play that follows a character named Helen, who is lovesick. She is also a daughter of a famous physician who is dead when the play begins. She's in love with a childhood acquaintance named Bertram, who's also kind of socially superior to her in the hierarchy. Uh, Bertram has also been called away to the French court, and we open the play with this knowledge that the French king is ill, specifically with the condition of a fistula, and none of his renowned physicians can create an adequate cure for him. Helen seizes the opportunity to use the medical knowledge and recipes that she has kind of inherited from her father to cure the king. Upon the successful administration of medical care, Helen asks for Bertram's hand in marriage as kind of payment for the services that she rendered to the king. Bertram is kind of appalled by this forced marriage, and so he runs away to fight in the war. Helen is not deterred at all by this, follows him into Italy, tricks him into sleeping with her, and then fakes her own death in order to encourage Bertram to return to the French court. And once he has returned, she kind of puts him slightly under suspicion of her death and is able to then reveal herself to be alive, resolve the conflict at the very end of the play. And it is at that moment where she declares that she managed to become pregnant with Bertram's child. And upon hearing this, and we can kind of imagine partially from the relief that he is no longer being accused of her murder, declares that if she truly is with his child, he's now prepared to accept her as his wife. This is a very bare bones and kind of chaotic description of the play, but it gives you some of the broad strokes of what we're dealing with. So the elements of this play that drew me to its content was, of course, the presence of Helen's decision to fake her own death, but more specifically, I was intrigued by the idea that the trope is taken up and used specifically by a prominent female healer of acknowledged skill and efficacy. This led me to questions about the relationship between the knowledge of medicine, the knowledge of death, and how gender played a role in these knowledge communities in early modern England. How did these two categories, that of death and that of healing, intermingle in early modern texts and early modern discourse? This question was further motivated by the way that the rhetoric of death, dying, and killing are integrated into the process of medical care within this play. In the opening scene of Shakespeare's play, the Countess, Bertram's mother, declares that were Helen's father still living, he would find a cure that would be the death of the king's disease. This moment at the beginning of the play establishes a motif wherein cures are facilitated through the language of death. Later, when Helen approaches the king to heal him, she assures him that what is infirm from your sound parts shall fly, health shall live, and sickness freely die. Instead of a language of pure restoration, the concept of healing in this play involves the process of death. The body is not simply healed, the disease must die for the patient to live. This feels like it stands in contrast to the way we often consider the role of the medical environment or the activation of medical care now. In the early 20th century, we can consider some of the imagery of Ivo Saliger, who depicted physicians physically or otherwise forcefully pushing away the specter of death. We can notice the placement of the hand on the skeletal figure and the notions of extricating and separating death from the vulnerable body of the patient. This same motif can be seen on the side of a medical center in Atlanta in the piece by Julian Hoke Harris titled Keeping Death Away. These examples show a concept of medical care that is diametrically opposed to the presence of death, and the medical figure stands as the guard against its image infringing upon the patient. This is further supported by the fact that the death and medical markets and industries are largely thought of as separate today. Funeral and mortuary industries are distinct from medical spaces. However, when we return to the play and look more closely at the spaces for medical knowledge, we will see much more of an intermingling between these spaces of health and death. And we can go to Philippe Ariès, a notable scholar on the history of death, and how he discusses that in the medical context of the early modern period, the state of death was under the purview of medical knowledge in a way that it no longer is. Quote, they looked at the dead body just as later they looked at the live body of the sick man in his bed. It is an attitude alien to modern medicine, in which death is inseparable from the disease of which it is one of the two possible outcomes, the other being recovery. We now study the disease and no longer the death, except in very special and now rather marginal cases of forensic medicine. The purpose of my talk today is to then explore these early modern dynamics and how these realms of death and medicine overlapped in the culture and how the play works within the intermingling of these concepts. The idea of my overall research is to link Helen's actions in faking her death as an extension of her healing practice, an idea largely ignored in readings of the play. Helen is a notable protagonist because she is a female doctor. Barbara Howard Traister explains Helen's significance because she is, quote, both physician and wooer, social roles ordinarily reserved for males, but she puts on neither male clothing nor male persona, end quote. Helen is also unique as a healer in Shakespeare's plays because of the prominence of her role. Traister notes, quote, Doctors and healers play few major roles in the drama of Shakespeare. In fact, only Helen, a completely unorthodox healer, has a leading role in Shakespeare's play. End quote. Helen is the healer of the play. In the play, she is specifically referred to as Dr. She, who steps forward and cures the king when all the male physicians had given up hope. Helen does not begin the play as a physician. She uses the knowledge and recipes from her father to accomplish her project of pursuing Bertram. But once she accepts the responsibility to heal, she maintains her role as a physician until the end of the play. Which is not to say that Helen is not uniquely primed to fill the role from the beginning. As the play suggests, Helen inherits her ability to heal from her father, a doctor of such renown that he is hailed as having the potential to make, quote, nature immortal, end quote, had he not fallen into mortality himself. Her initial motivations to heal may be less genuine, but her skills are refined and justified throughout the narrative. What is also notable about Helen is that she succeeds in healing the king where other notable physicians have entirely failed. Perhaps this can be attributed to the mastery of her father, but we might also be able to read her presence as the directing factor in the efficacy of the cure. At the beginning of the play, we are told that the king has been languishing with his fistula for a period of time and has abandoned his physicians, and his physicians themselves are later described as saying that they cannot help him. Later, a character remarks that neither the knowledge of Galen or Paracelsus were capable of healing the king, yet Helen triumphs while all others had failed. Helen, who is described as a, quote, poor, unlearned virgin, succeeds when the schools emboweled of their doctrine have left off the danger to itself, end quote. When Helen advocates for her capabilities, she credits her father's knowledge while also leveraging something more. She says directly, "There's something in it more than my father's skill, which has the greatest of his profession, that his good receipt shall for my legacy be sanctified by the unluckiest stars in heaven, and would your honor but give me leave to try success, I'd venture the well-lost life of mine on his grace's cure." I would like to posit that Helen activates two realms of knowledge here, both derived from her position as that female healer. The first comes through the invocation of the domestic sphere of medicine through the trade of the medical recipe of her father. The second is in her bringing her own death into the conversation with her power to heal. Let us turn first to the medical receipt that we are told of. The recipe is her father's, but the language also brings up similarities to the most prevalent form of healing in the early modern period, namely the domestic healing, which was largely dominated by women. Elaine Leong and Sarah Pennell, when discussing the recipe marketplace of the early modern period, remark that it has long been acknowledged that the primary arena for medical treatment in the pre-modern era was the household. The decision to call in the services of a physician, surgeon, apothecary, or other forms of paid medical practice usually followed the failure of domestic treatment to cure or alleviate conditions. This hierarchy of resort conspired to make commercial medical treatment an occasional rather than a regular event. Individuals mostly saw their own corporeal care as a domestic matter rather than a cause for outside intervention. Being associated with the domestic space, we also see how this type of medicine was largely considered under the purview of the female healer. Leong and Pennell explained that many of our medical records come from manuscripts that both contain curative and household recipes, a tradition we see in the language used in the play. As Leong and Pennell state, salving the sick at home and in the locality loomed larger in early modern moral idealizations of the good housewife, end quote. Therefore, the intervention of a female physician working from a family recipe book would not have been as entirely novel as the characters of the play seem to suggest. Domestic medicine was by far the most familiar and utilized in the scope of these manuals, and they could be quite broad. Quote, domestic medical activities were focused on dealing with a range of non-life-threatening ailments, although recipe collections do also include treatments for conditions which usually proved fatal, such as plague, the sweating sickness, and rabies, end quote. Leong and Pennell explain how, quote, the ubiquity of domestic medicine and its association with female household skills that are largely seen as intellectually static, tacitly transmitted, and either resistant to or uninteresting for historical inquiry has meant that little attention has been given to the knowledge economy underpinning household medical production. Considering the ways in which medical information was acquired and how it was evaluated as knowledge in the domestic environment is a necessary step in the task of reinscribing the central role played by the household in the early modern medical market. Helen, in the play, participates in this medical market, and we can see her intervention with the king's disease as a form of reasserting this more basic form of medical economy, something that the highly trained and potentially out of touch male physicians are unwilling to consider in the pursuit of cure. Additionally, the female aspect of the healer was also bound up in the way healing was understood as a process in the early modern period, particularly in the feminine personification of nature. In the early modern period, there was considered a tripartite system to healing disease. It was a collaborative process between God, the physician, and the body's nature. What we now understand as a person's natural healing factor was, in the early modern period, seen as an active and independent entity existing within the body. While largely based in the Hippocratic and Galenic traditions, this nature entity was often an aspect of early modern care that transcended the boundaries of different educational disciplines. Hannah Newton explains, quote, nature's role in recovery was summed up by the philosopher and the chemist Robert Boyle in his crucial exposition of mainstream views of this agent, published in 1686. Boyle states, men are wont to believe that there resides in the body of a sick person a certain provident or watchful being that industriously employs itself to restore the distempered body to its pristine state of health, end quote. Later, Newton explains that this watchful being was often characterized by a particularly feminine gender. Quote, nature was personified as a benevolent female who looked after the body, and the Northampton Puritan physician James Hart stated, quote, nature is like a kind and loving mother, being very solicitous and careful of the life of man, end quote. She was also depicted as a charwoman who, quote, scoured away illness, end quote, sweeping every corner and making the whole body polite and trim. Nature's economic status varied. The astrologer physician Nicholas Culpeper called her a, quote, plain and homely woman in a beggarly contemptible condition, end quote, whose, quote, ways are very plain, you may find them in the darkest night without a candle, end quote. But she was also titled Dame or Lady Nature and depicted an elite gentlewoman who presided over the task of recovery as a mistress over her household servants. In these descriptions, the body is envisioned as a house and disease as dirt or an unruly guest, which needed to be washed away or turned out. And it made sense to depict nature as female because the majority of her roles fell into the category of women's work. As well as tending the sick, she was responsible for nourishment and production, tasks in which even elite ladies were expected to have some expertise, end quote. Newton also interestingly points out that while nature was often feminine because healing was associated with female duties, there were also depictions of nature that represented her closer to a warrior queen, exhibiting masculine levels of aggression in pursuit of the defense of the home, which is the body. Newton also posits, quote, female patients and practitioners may have felt a special affinity with nature as fellow female healers. This was implied by the prominent London surgeon John Woodall, who commented that the old wife's medicament, because she wrestleth not with nature as great masters do, and nature, pleased with her mild and simple means, is appeased, and by divine providence the disease often easily made whole. The gentle treatments associated with women practitioners were seen as more acceptable to nature, end quote. This places our character of Helen as succeeding because she is tapping into this tradition associated with female healing, that she succeeds because she can work outside of the male hubris of the physicians. It is in her famous soliloquy that Helen transforms into the role of healer. When Helen realizes our remedies oft in ourselves do lie, we see her claiming that healing power for herself. When asked about her motives to follow Bertram to the court, Helen reveals her inherited medical knowledge, stating, "You know my father left me some prescriptions of rare and proved effects, such as his reading and manifest experience had collected. Amongst the rest, there is a remedy approved, set down, to cure the desperate languishings whereof the king is rendered lost." Helen's resolution for a remedy within herself is not merely empty words. In this moment, we see Helen having both the will and the knowledge to find the remedies she seeks. When the Countess doubts her ability to be accepted at the court as a healer because she is a poor, unlearned virgin, Helen responds with conviction that there's something in it more than her father's skill. She pushes her abilities beyond just the domain of her father, and by reading the cultural perception of female healers, we might be able to see this as a moment reaching back to these types of medical traditions. While Helen uses the role of a physician to pursue her own self-interests, this moment displays her assertion of her own identity as a healer. She is confident that she has more than just her father's skill, and she connects the endeavor to her own legacy and her own life. As Traister notes, Helen is an unorthodox healer, and while she is not recognized institutionally as a physician, there is no doubt within the play and within herself that she occupies that role. But what exactly does Helen cure the king of? In the text, we are told directly that the king is suffering from a fistula. However, this does open up some ambiguity in the text that can direct our understanding of Helen's medical knowledge. In broad strokes, a fistula can be explained as an improperly treated wound or infection that in the process of draining actually carves out a channel that then extends the wound to other places in the body. The use of the term within the play could indicate an improperly treated wound on the breast of the king, wherein a pocket was allowed to fester and swell. Commonly, however, the term fistula was used to indicate shorthand for an anal fistula. This type of fistula was often considered the more concerning and difficult to cure, mostly because of the exposed wound being constantly exposed to the waste from its location in the anus. The text of the play does little to disambiguate what kind of fistula we are dealing with, but the associations within the play often lean towards a type of sexual undertone to the type of healing that Helen accomplishes. And it's important to note that within the context of the play, we never see the healing take place directly. It happens entirely off stage, and the exact process that is applied is not described to the audience. There are a couple of characters who suggest through innuendo that the king has simply experienced a sexual rejuvenation, possibly as a way to diminish Helen's role as a medical healer. However, that being said, Helen healing the king through sexual knowledge would not necessarily be entirely outside of the realm of possibility. Aside from the general household domestic medic, the most recognized form of female healer in the early modern period would have been the position of midwife. Knowledge of birth and reproduction were still considered the domain of the female healer, even as formalized medical education began to shift the power dynamics of the medical field. The idea that Helen might have sexual and reproductive knowledge is supported later in the play when she uses a bed trick to get Bertram to sleep with her. We watch in the play as she gives directions to have Bertram take her virginity, but then to stay with her for an hour in silence, a moment that some have attributed to a process or ritual that might ensure conception. Helen goes through this whole process because Bertram left her with a letter instructing that he will not truly be her husband unless she can somehow get his ring on her finger and conceive his child. In the accomplishment of these goals, we see Helen displaying a certain degree of sexual medical knowledge. So when the court might be disparaging her role as a healer as tied to sexuality, we might also see the indication of the broadening of the sphere of medical knowledge as something that encompasses sexual knowledge as well. Whether or not a woman fulfilled the role of midwife, the traditional presence of women during childbirth would connect most women with certain medical experience with reproduction, but also notably with death. Jean Dennison describes that the tradition in all social classes was to summon friends and relations who had themselves born children to witness the proceedings. Dennison goes on to describe how, quote, this custom fulfilled several needs. First, the presence of a number of experienced women could provide support to the mother during a trying and dangerous process of childbirth. Second, in enabling older women to acquire greater knowledge of the processes of childbirth, it could become a educative function as well. Third, these gatherings ensured that there were witnesses to the birth, and importantly, which Dennison does not mention, witnesses to death. Due to the dangerous nature of childbirth at the time period, this tradition also implies that women would have been particularly familiar with death as much as birth. And in this place, we see that sought after overlap between medical knowledge and death knowledge as it is bound together in feminine spheres of domesticity. Not only would women have particular exposure to death and knowledge of the process through their experience of childbirth and resulting death, death would have also been a largely domestic role, as dying would take place in the home in an age before the institutionalization of medical places and the displacement of dying into these medicalized spaces. Women would often have a close contact with the dead bodies as they were prepared for burial in the home. This also led to a culture in which early forensic knowledge was a female role. We see this specifically in the history of women searchers for the bills of mortality. Rochelle Munkoff explains that, quote, from at least the 1570s and perhaps much earlier, poor women were hired by their parishes to perform the office of searcher during plague outbreaks, end quote. In essence, these women were organized to examine living and dead bodies to find evidence of the plague in order to determine outbreak zones and the need for quarantines. Munkoff explains, however, that by, quote, 1629, their responsibilities had expanded to include determining a cause of death for everybody that died in the parish, except in those cases that came under the purview of the coroner, such as homicide, end quote. The information these women compiled would then be transcribed, tallied, and published as data organized in the bills of mortality. These women were playing pivotal roles in the tracking and understanding of disease, death, and epidemics. Although their data was far from perfect, and in fact, as early as 1662, with John Graunt's analysis of these bills, these women were put down as inherently unreliable because of their lack of sanctioned medical training and education. People would also make the argument, because they were often poorer women, that they could be bribed to, say, underreport a death due to syphilis because they were paid off by a family not wanting to be associated with that shame. As such, Munkoff explains that while the bills of mortality were accepted as central to our understanding of disease and death data, the contribution of the female searchers has been repeatedly denigrated and minimized as ignorant and unreliable. Munkoff then argues that, quote, "We need to appreciate how these women are deeply connected to the medical marketplace in early modern culture, and that their position derives from expertise rather than ignorance in matters of the body." Munkoff quotes then Thomas Dekker, the early modern playwright and pamphleteer, and how he describes the process of the searchers. Quote, "When a person died, relatives sent to the sexton of the church to have the bell rung for him, and on the morrow, as the custom is, the searchers came to the house where he lay to discharge their office, asking for the dead body and in what room it lay." End quote. Later, John Grant described how the searchers, quote, "repair to the place where the dead corpse lies, and by view of the same, and by other enquiries, they examine by what disease or casualty the corpse died," end quote. In the description of the searchers, we see these female figures engaged in diagnostic readings of the body to locate causes of death, an occupation that also caused them to become familiar with signs and results of illnesses. Munkoff explains, quote, "What once might have been seen as simple dichotomy between elite or learned medical practice and the unqualified quack has become a much more complex and nuanced picture. With a plethora of practitioners offering a wide spectrum of care to a wide variety of people under a wide variety of circumstances, the searchers fit into this spectrum not because they offer care, but because they perform their duties of reckoning death within a very specific world of medical understanding and a particular semiology," end quote. In these examples, we see how women were often at the center of developing knowledge around medicine and disease, but specifically through the avenues of gaining that knowledge through a study of death. These examples bring the discourse of death and medicine into conversation. While Helen does not necessarily fit into any of these groups, nor do I wish to suggest we read her as a direct reference to any of these occupations, I think what we can attribute to this research is a more complex web of medical knowledge that is intrinsically tied to knowledge of death and that is pursued by female actors. Perhaps Helen can succeed because she activates these different registers of knowledge. The idea that she can heal the king because she has knowledge of traditional medical recipes, combined with sexual and reproductive knowledge, as well as an understanding and ability to perceive the signs of death, is what allows Helen to cure the king where others have failed. Making these connections can also help us to reinterpret Helen's decision to fake her own death. I want to argue that Helen's decision to fake her own death still acts within the purview of her medical knowledge. Specifically, we might look at her decision as an acquisition of death knowledge meant to support a vicarious medical experience. In the beginning, when I was describing the project of my dissertation, I organized it around the idea that these instances of false death could be different ways to perform early modern death arts. In my research on recovery methods of the early modern period, I discovered that there was a genre of literature highly influenced by the Ars Moriendi that was the art of recovery, opposed to the art of dying. These were specifically didactic texts formed from authors ruminating on their near-death experiences. Timothy Rogers, a Presbyterian minister, told his parishioners that, quote, "In his discourses you will find a relation of some part of my affliction, which he hoped would be able to enable them to experience vicariously the motion from suffering to ease." This emphasis on vicarious knowledge acquisition by putting yourself in the position of the person recovering from a brush with death we might be able to recontextualize Helen's actions as an actualization or a performance of this type of vicarious experience. She puts herself in the position of the dead and then demonstrates a process of recovery at the end of the play. We might also be able to read the ending of the play as Helen pushing the characters into the crisis of disease or the critical expulsion. This is a concept in Galenic texts that is regarded as the turning point in illness, whereby the sick is either brought to recovery or death. During the early modern period, this theory posits that a major and swift evacuation was needed to remove the infecting influence and allow for cure. However, this violent form of evacuation and expulsion would bring the body violently close to death. Once again, we see the process of death and health intermingling along the thinnest of lines here. In this perception of healing, death must be approached as closely as possible if one is to recover from illness. They are not presented as opposite ends of the spectrum, but rather situated right next to each other. When Helen fakes her death, she creates a crisis moment in the French court and leads to a frankly chaotic final scene. In medical terms, recovery depended on creating a, quote, perfect crisis, which is described as a crisis that evacuates all the vicious matter, and an imperfect crisis is that which evacuates but some part of it. Whether or not we are able to see this ending scene as a perfect or an imperfect crisis is pretty much the question of the entire play. Is all well because we have ended things well? Have we achieved a perfect crisis where the bad elements have been ejected and we can move forward with the recovery of the king, the relationship between Bertram and Helen, and by extension, the communities in which they belong? As a final path of my research, which I have been considering, and in regards to these readings of this instance of false death, I have also considered how we might read the possibility of the pregnancy as proposed at the end of the play. I've been attempting to demonstrate that Helen achieves her goals through a synthesis of death and medical rhetoric, through her position as a female healer and the cultural traditions associated with that role. However, there is another medical figure associated with medical symbology that is inextricably linked with the iconography of death as well. And in this, I'm thinking mainly of Asclepius, the god of medicine, who is often associated with medical iconography to this day. In myths, Asclepius is the son of Apollo, who becomes such a prolific healer that he can even raise the dead, a feat for which he is punished and killed by Zeus, and then later raised into a constellation. Cults of Asclepius are often associated with foundations of medical knowledge, and his name is even referenced in the Hippocratic Oath. In the early modern period, we see his association with both death and medicine most directly in Edmund Spenser's The Faerie Queene, where Duessa calls upon his healing powers in the underworlds. What is also notable is that in many of his myths, Asclepius is a baby born from a dead mother through a cesarean section. Therefore, the image of a dead woman bearing a child could have resonances with the Asclepius myth, and therefore could suggest a type of rejuvenating ending in which a more healthful future is represented in the potential child of Helen and Bertram, if that child actually exists. Though there are still elements I'm trying to situate in my research, and they have not fully been formed yet on this point. Overall, my project uses this play, and specifically this character and her actions, to ask questions about the medical knowledge of the early modern period, and how knowledge of death intersected with these same questions. Again, I don't wish to suggest that this reading is in some way the direct intention of Shakespeare, but rather I'm interested in how this play might exist during a period of time when these questions were being asked and where conversations and examinations of living and dead bodies were overlapping in productive ways. Not only do the historical medical texts help us to understand and interpret aspects of this play, in new and interesting ways. I think the specific way this play blends health and death makes it a uniquely suitable text to bring these historical texts into conversation with each other, especially in the way it helps us to think about women's roles in the acquisition and implementation of medical and death knowledge. And this is in part important because these roles have often been undermined in the historical narrative up to this point, and it is the purview of the medical humanities to explore the affordances of these records and the context they can provide, both in how the medical field worked and developed historically, but also how this knowledge can help us to reflect on our medical processes and biases today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Chelsea, do we have any questions? That was wonderful. Any questions from anybody? Catherine.
I do have a question.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like, I guess it's kind of two questions combined and they're kind of chaotic. So tell me if this doesn't make sense. But this was so interesting.
Yeah.
And I'm really like, I was especially fascinated by the idea of a kind of internal feminized nature as being kind of a part of everyone's body, like not just women, especially when you were listing the different ways in which that feminized figure is framed. And I was really struck by the various class positions that you mentioned. So you had everything from like the lady of the household to a charwoman scraping the kind of disease out. And so I wondered if you had thought at all about Helen's class position, because I feel like in the play there's a kind of tension that comes from her, her class difference from Bertram. He's this kind of like noble lord, and she is the lowly son of a kind of like middle class figure. And so I wondered, does the labor that she performed, is it gendered and also classed? And if so, does that change the kind of dynamic of her healing process with the king, and how we might see the role of like various classes within the social body that is maybe represented by the king's body, if that makes sense? Sorry, it was really
Yes.
long.
No, a lot of good thoughts working with here. So yeah, I do think, and I was also kind of pulled to that moment with the description of nature that is just like very kind of socially mutable, right? Where, as you were saying, in one description is considered like the most, like the homeliest, most common creature. And then in others is like described as, near to royalty, or like um the sort of mistress of the house type imagery. And I do think, in the scope of this paper or this talk, I wasn't really able to focus on the class dynamics, but I do think, right, that that is a major element also of her position as a healer, and also her position in the play is that she represents this kind of outside force into the French court. Um, and that's really like the whole reason that Bertram provides for not wanting to marry her is that she is of lower class, and he doesn't want to, sully himself with that. Uh, to which the king kind of comes in and says, I can make all things equal. I can have this issue of, hierarchy resolved. But I think it is kind of interesting when we're looking at these ideas of nature, kind of the ideas of also the poor women in the Plague Searchers, right? This kind of position of lower classes being somewhat, instrumental to like this medical knowledge and this acquisition. Uh, and I think I'm kind of moving towards a reading that I don't know if I fully agree with yet, but that there is kind of a potential reading of this play that like part of the healing process of the community, where like, the king is sick, the entire nation is in the midst of a war, there's a lot of problems with kind of, heirs and the issue of kind of like blood and the next generation. And I think there's a potential reading to see Helen and kind of the potential baby at the end as this, you know, stirring up the stagnation of the court, of getting kind of new perspectives, new knowledge, not just with Helen as kind of a woman, but also Helen as kind of coming from this background, this kind of different background, um, and moving things forward in different ways. So yeah, I hope that answers some of your question.
No, that was great. Thank you.
Yeah, excellent. Any other questions? That was just lovely. Um, any other thoughts from the participants? All right, Chelsea. Well, thank you so much. I'm so grateful for your time, and I wish you the best on the next steps in your journey. We're sending you a lot of energies for the last year, so it's always like, mayhem, but hopefully it's a peaceful mayhem if that works out well.
Yes.
So
Yep.
thank
We'll get through
you.
it. Thank you.
Yeah, and look forward to learning more about your work in the future. So thank you so much, and everyone, I hope you have a wonderful day.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye.
Great question, Catherine.